Does Christmas matter? Somebody shared a comment with me about a recent blog I did that wanted to affirm something I said in that blog about the priority, the centrality of love. In their comment, they talked about how in this day and age when it seems like the world is on fire, things are falling apart at the seams, it's more important than ever that we love one another, that we focus on loving one another. But not just loving one another, they talked about how we need to love one another in a more radical way, loving even our enemies. And then they went on to say that we shouldn't allow anyone define somebody else or some other group as an enemy of ours. Instead, we should love so unconditionally that we don't see anybody as our enemy. And then they said something that I really love. They talked about how that if we do that, if we love this radically, this unconditionally, that will really turn us towards the divine, no matter what name you give it. In other words, if we love this radically, this unconditionally, we will open our hearts up to the divine, because that is the divine nature. I loved their comment. I think that sentiment is such a beautiful, powerful, attractive sentiment, because it happens to be my bias, my confirmation bias. I would love to believe with all my heart that this is true, that the ultimate reality, the divine reality, is unconditional love. And that it really doesn't matter how you name that reality, as long as you're turning toward it as a God of unconditional love. That's the essence of what the divine is. So it doesn't really matter what the differences are among the different religions, because deep down they're all pointing to this same reality. You don't have to argue about different truth claims. We can all agree that ultimately what we believe in, what we're turning toward, is a God of unconditional love. And I would believe that with all my heart, except for one thing. That comment and the sentiment behind it, not picking on the person in the comment, it's actually a widespread sentiment in our culture, makes an assumption, a huge assumption, that just isn't true. See, it assumes that this is self-evident. Not only is it self-evident that the different religious traditions are simply giving different names to the same ultimate reality, that deep down they're pointing to that same reality, the same divine nature, but it's assuming that it's perfectly self-evident to anybody who will give it a second's thought, that the divine nature can be nothing less than love, perfect love, unconditional love, this radical kind of love. There are many people who aren't sure that God even exists, agnostics, and there are many people who are sure God doesn't exist, atheists, who believe the same thing, that if it just so happened that there was a God, that for them, they insist, they believe that God could be nothing less than this radical, unconditional, all-inclusive, all-embracing, all-accepting kind of love. But the problem is, it's not perfectly self-evident. Not by a long shot. It's actually not self-evident at all. But don't trust me, a Christian. Trust an agnostic who happens to be a highly regarded historian specializing in ancient history, a man named Tom Holland, who wrote this book, Dominion. And as somebody who is not a Christian apologist, he doesn't believe in Christianity at all. He thinks that the supernatural elements of it are mythological, that it's largely a myth. So he doesn't believe that Jesus was God incarnate. But he does make the historical case to say that what we take as self-evident, the values that we think are self-evident, values like the intrinsic dignity of each and every person, the intrinsic worth, and therefore the fundamental equality of each and every person, and the corollaries to that, like inclusivity, acceptance, tolerance, values like the virtue of charity, or the preeminent virtues of charity or mercy, like giving people a second chance or third chance or fourth chance, giving people a chance to redeem themselves. Values like championing the underdog or protecting the least and the most vulnerable in society. All those values, which we take as self-evident, in fact, they're written into the Constitution with language to that effect. All these values that we take as self-evident aren't self-evident at all. In fact, his argument is that they weren't self-evident to any other culture or religious tradition prior to Christianity. In fact, the subtitle of his book is How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And his point is the things, even though we're not aware of where these values come from, the things that we treasure most, the values that we treasure most in our culture, are actually distinctly, uniquely Christian values. They only come through Christianity, through our culture that has been affected, profoundly, indelibly affected by Christianity and its values. Holland is not easy on Christianity. Like if you read this book, you'll see he's very harsh and critical and condemnatory in many ways, justifiably so, of many periods in Christian history where it did not uphold these values. In fact, did almost the exact opposite, became a dominion, was oppressing people. But he does talk about how, because these values were so baked in to the worldview of people who were Christian, that worldview kept subverting these different dominions and continues to this day. It's an incredible book. I don't have time to go into all the details, but he can even trace things that are happening today, movements today, as having their roots in these Christian ideals that subvert things that are oppressive, often things that the church has become complicit in or participated in. So it's an amazing book that I encourage you to read. But his thesis ultimately is this, that these values, the Christian revolution, is grounded in this conviction, the conviction that God became human on that first Christmas day, that God became human and walked among us. And that when he did, when the Lord of the universe became a human being in Jesus, he came with stunning humility, not seeking to be served, but to serve. He came, the Holy One of God came, and he hung out with sinners. He associated with sinners, offering outrageous mercy to the most despicable sinners of his day. Wild, amazing grace. The one who is the source of the universe, the source of all that is, the power behind it all, came and hung out with the most marginalized, the weakest, the most vulnerable in his society. He sought them out, the people at the margins. The one who is Lord of the universe said that he identified with the least. And ultimately, in the end, the living God, who in human form in Jesus, would give his life as a ransom for all, rich and poor alike. And what Holland points out is that when you believe in that kind of a God, when that's your conviction, if this God identifies with the least, for example, then you cannot treat the least with the utmost dignity, with the sense of that they have even an infinite worth. And that was a revolution because no other culture, no other religious tradition held that. In fact, cultures or religious traditions that hold that today, like for example the Baha'i religion or elements of the New Age movement that have that conviction about these values and about how they flow out of their understanding of God, they're totally borrowed from Christianity. They're not an innovation. They're not a revelation. They're not something new. They're not a revolution. They're borrowed. And when they get borrowed, they never have the same depth or breadth or heights of love. They aren't as radical. Their love is not, their concept of God isn't as of divine that is as loving, as radically loving, as unconditionally loving, as all-inclusive, all-accepting, all-embracing. Because they can't be unless your conviction is that it is God himself who became human and did the things Jesus did, that in the way that is the most supreme way that God could love us, sublime way, then you can't have that same conviction about the divine nature and the same understanding of the values that flow from that. I heard recently, I think it's like 6 or 7 days ago, that the Canadian Human Rights Commission is deliberating whether or not to outlaw Christmas, because they talked about Christmas, the celebration of Christmas, being discriminatory. That it's kind of bringing up the worst parts of the colonialist history of Canada, of Christianity being oppressive, being a dominion, and excluding people, minority groups, people of minority religions. And so they're concerned about people, groups in Canada right now that aren't Christian. They don't want them to feel excluded by the celebration of Christmas. They don't want the least of these in their culture, the most vulnerable, to be offended by this celebration, to feel like they are somehow less than or second-class citizens. Whatever you think of this move or this potential move that the Human Rights Commission, Canadian Human Rights Commission wants to make, I have no doubt that the members of that commission are doing this out of a really good, a really noble motive. They want to protect people at the margins. But I'm also pretty sure that even though their motives, I take for granted that they're good motives, even though their motives are really good, I don't think they have any idea where they get the values that they're trying to promote and preach, the values that they're trying to promulgate by being inclusive to the least of these. I don't think they have any idea that those very values are rooted in the holiday, the celebration that they're trying to eliminate. For those who will go to, or who live in a society or culture where Christmas will be celebrated this year, many will go to church and they'll hear the prologue to John's Gospel, John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. And in that prologue, there's a couple of verses that often don't get focused on much, but which also happen to drive commentators crazy because it's hard to interpret what they're saying. Verses 16 and 17. In 16, it talks about from his fullness, Jesus' fullness, the Word made flesh's fullness. We have all received grace upon grace. That in the Greek it's two words, the words for grace on either side of three words, excuse me. It's the words grace on either side of a word in between, anti. And anti can be translated three different ways depending on the context. It can be translated as accumulation, grace upon grace. It can be translated in a sense of matching, grace corresponding, so grace matching grace. And it can be translated in the sense of replacement, grace in place of grace. Most modern interpreters now will interpret it that third way, in the sense of replacement, so that it is grace in place of grace. And the reason they do that is because of what John says in verse 17. Immediately following, he talks about how while the law came through Moses, this grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. What John seems to be saying there is that the grace that came in the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, was of a different order than the grace that comes through Jesus Christ. While God had revealed himself to some extent, that grace had limitations to it, or a conditionality, or just didn't have the fullness that the grace that comes in Jesus Christ does. Because the grace that comes in Jesus, the Word made flesh, is the supreme expression of God's love. In fact, there can be no more supreme or sublime expression of God's love. It is the greatest possible act of love for God to become human and ultimately to give his life for us to save us on the cross. That is the greatest expression, the most perfect expression, the fullest, the most radical expression of God's love. There is no more of an unconditional love than this. And without that conviction, you can't understand the divine nature as being the most radical, unconditional, perfect love possible, the most sublime love possible, the very thing that we assume in our culture is perfectly self-evident, that every other religion points to. As Holland points out, as a matter of historical record, that contrast that John is drawing out between the Old Testament, Old Covenant, and the grace that comes through Jesus Christ is the contrast that exists between Christianity and every other religious tradition, every other concept of God, and the values that flow out of that. That's just a matter of the historical record, that it is only when you see God as a human being, when you celebrate Christmas and what happened that day, that you can understand the full depth and breadth and heights of God's love, that you can understand that this grace is the most radical grace possible, the most sublime expression of God's love, a truly unconditional love. So does Christmas matter? Yes, yes, 1,000,000 times yes. Christmas is the reason that we have this concept of God, this revolutionary concept of God. Christmas is the reason that we have so many of the values that we think are self-evident today, but which we know are self-evidently the most superior values. I mean, who would deny that our belief in the fundamental, the intrinsic dignity of each and every person, the fundamental equality that goes along with that, the corollary values of inclusion and acceptance and tolerance, who would deny that those are superior values to any other alternatives to that, to the many alternatives throughout history, from the caste system to the Roman household codes to any kind of hierarchical type of system, or system that would oppress or dominate, have some kind of dominion over people. These values are clearly the supreme, the most sublime of human values, but they only come as a matter of historical fact. They only come through the Christian Revolution. And that's why Christmas matters. Well, you, like Tom Holland, may think that the supernatural elements of Christianity are simply a myth, while you might take the history that he basically shows, demonstrates, proves. Well, you may take that as reality, as fact, that there was this historical person, Jesus, that walked the face of the earth, and a group around him that eventually became convinced he was God incarnate. You may doubt that he actually was God incarnate. And if you do believe that it's a myth, I encourage you to check out my next blog, which is my Christmas blog, where I'm going to talk about something that Jesus says in the Gospels that he could have never said, could have never known, unless he actually was God incarnate. There are a lot of ways to show that, or I think demonstrate and prove that he's God incarnate, from the evidence to the resurrection to miracles to a lot of other things that can demonstrate that. But this is something that I don't think anybody has really picked up on or exploited, has really taken apart and shown. And that's what I'm going to do in my next blog. So if you think Christianity is simply a myth, or want to see some really good evidence for the truth of it, that Jesus actually was God in human form, then please don't miss my next blog.